My name is Claire. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the reliable one, the one who answers calls, the one who figures things out, the one who doesn't make things messy. I'm not loud. I'm not dramatic. I don't take up much space when I walk into a room. People usually assume that means I'm easygoing, flexible, or that I don't notice much. They're half right. I've worked in finance for years. Quietly, steadily, without needing to announce it. I've built a life that looks calm from the outside. No scandals, no big declarations, just consistency, responsibility, and, for a very long time, a deep sense that it was my job to hold things together for everyone else. If you'd asked my family how they'd describe me, they would have said things like generous, dependable, or good with money. What they wouldn't have said is that I was tired, or that I was afraid, or that every yes I gave was slowly costing me something I couldn't put a number on. This story isn't about villains. It's not about revenge, or dramatic confrontations, or someone finally winning. It's about what happens when expectations go unquestioned for too long, and what it really costs to finally say no. For years, my family expected me to fund everyone, not in a single obvious way. There was no meeting where it was declared, no contract signed. It happened in small, reasonable requests, emergencies, short-term help. Just this once. And because I could help, I did. Because I didn't want to disappoint anyone, I did. Because it felt easier than explaining myself, I did. What I didn't understand at the time was that saying no was more expensive than money. It threatened my role, my image, the fragile peace I had learned to protect at all costs. This story follows the slow, almost invisible shift from that version of me to the woman I am now. There are no shouting matches here, no slammed doors, just quiet decisions made over time that changed the balance of everything. I'll talk about the first moments I dismissed as nothing. The way disrespect can become normalized when it's wrapped in familiarity. The role I didn't realize I had been assigned, and how comfortable everyone else was with me staying there. And I'll talk about in the moment something shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. The moment silence stopped being fear and became a choice. I'm telling this story not to paint myself as a hero and not to ask for sympathy. I'm telling it because I know how many people are living inside similar expectations, quietly paying emotional debts they never agreed to. So as you listen, I want you to listen gently, without judgment, toward me, but also toward yourself. Have you ever wondered what it's really costing you to keep the peace? For most of my life, I was the background hum in my family, not the melody, just the sound that let everything else function smoothly. I was the one people called when something broke, not just physically, but structurally. A missed payment, a confusing letter from the bank, a plan that hadn't quite been thought through. I didn't rush in dramatically. I didn't lecture. I listened, asked a few quiet questions, and made the problem smaller, manageable, solvable. Over time, that became my identity. At family gatherings, no one asked me how I was doing in a way that invited a real answer. They asked what I thought about interest rates, or whether refinancing made sense, or if I could take a quick look at something later. I was seated slightly apart, not excluded, just positioned. Close enough to be useful, far enough not to disrupt the flow. I don't think anyone intended harm. That's important to say. There was no cruelty in it, just a steady assumption that I would handle things, that I could absorb inconvenience without it registering as a cost. I learned early that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone. When I was younger, praise came in the form of relief. Thank God you're good with money. We'd be lost without you. Those words sound like appreciation, and maybe they were, but they also came with an unspoken expectation. Stay this way. So I did. When relatives struggled, I stepped in quietly. Not with grand gestures, but with transfers, spreadsheets, and don't worry about it smiles. I framed everything as temporary, even when it wasn't. I told myself that families help each other, that this was what stability was for. What I didn't realize was how invisible that made me. No one asked what I was postponing to make room for them. No one noticed the tension I carried when I opened my banking app. Because I never dramatized it, it didn't seem dramatic. Because I handled it calmly, it seemed effortless. I became reliable in a way that erased my edges. At work, people described me as solid. At home, I was the sensible one. Those labels sound flattering until you realize they leave no space for need. Solid things don't get checked on. Sensible people don't get asked if they're overwhelmed. I rarely complained, partly because I didn't have the language for what I felt. It wasn't anger, it wasn't resentment, at least not yet. It was a dull compression, like living in a room where the ceiling slowly lowers, 1 inch at a time. I remember sitting at a family dinner once, listening to a conversation about a vacation someone wanted to take but couldn't afford. The room naturally tilted toward me. Not in words, just in posture, in pauses. Someone laughed and said, "Well, Claire's the banker." Everyone smiled. I smiled too. Inside, something small folded in on itself. I wasn't seen as a person with limits. I was seen as a resource. Renewable, quiet, safe. And the strange thing is, I helped build that version of myself. Every time I said yes without context, every time I minimized my own hesitation, every time I told myself it was easier not to explain. I didn't think of it as a sacrifice. I thought of it as being mature. Looking back now, I can see how carefully I made myself easy to lean on, how I confused peace with absence. I believed that as long as no one was upset, things were fine. But being needed isn't the same as being known. And when people only know what you provide, they stop asking who you are. At that stage, I still believed that if I kept showing up, balance would eventually appear on its own. That consideration would naturally follow consistency. That fairness didn't need to be requested, it would be felt. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. The first moment I remember clearly didn't arrive with noise. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a sentence that landed a little heavier than it should have. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that feels harmless by default. My sister had invited everyone over for coffee. Nothing formal. People drifted in and out of conversations. Someone mentioned a bill that had gone up unexpectedly, utilities, I think. The tone was casual, almost joking. Then my sister looked at me and said, "Well, Claire will know what to do." She didn't ask, she didn't explain. She didn't even wait for a response. The conversation simply moved on, as if the problem had already been transferred out of the room and into me. I remember nodding automatically, smiling even, because that was the rhythm I had learned. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not because it was new, but because it was assumed. Later that evening, after most people had left, she followed me into the kitchen with her phone already unlocked. "Can you just check this?" she said, handing it to me. "It's probably nothing, but I don't want to mess it up." I looked at the numbers. I saw the pattern immediately. Overspending masked as bad luck. A shortfall that wasn't temporary, just unaddressed. I started to explain gently. I always did, but she interrupted me halfway through and said, "It's fine. I'll just borrow from you for now and fix it next month." Borrow. The word was used lightly, like a placeholder, like something that didn't need definition. I hesitated, just for a second, long enough to feel my chest tighten. She noticed. "It's not a big deal," she added quickly. "You're better off than the rest of us." That was the cut. Small, precise, almost invisible. Not the request, but the framing. Better off, as if my stability existed in a vacuum, as if it weren't the result of years of restraint, planning, and choices I made daily, as if it were a trait, not an effort. I transferred the money. I told myself I was overthinking it, that families don't keep score, that she didn't mean anything by it. But I remembered the moment later that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the ease with which the decision had been made for me. How my hesitation had been smoothed over instead of addressed. No one else in the room had noticed. Or if they had, they didn't consider it important enough to pause the conversation. That's how these things begin, not with cruelty, but with convenience. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. A comment about how lucky I was, a joke about how I'd figure it out anyway. Each one was small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. What stayed with me wasn't the money. It was the absence of curiosity. No one asked if it was okay. No one asked what it cost me. The assumption was that my capacity was endless and therefore irrelevant. I started noticing how quickly discomfort moved away from others and settled onto me. If there was tension in the room about finances, it relaxed the moment I was involved. My presence acted like a release valve, and slowly, quietly, I began to understand that my role wasn't just to help, it was to absorb. At the time, I still didn't challenge it. I didn't even name it out loud. I told myself that noticing didn't mean resenting, that awareness was neutral. But once you see the first small cut, you start noticing how many others were always there, hidden under politeness, laughter, and the expectation that you'll take care of it. And you start to realize that no one is going to stop the bleeding for you. After the first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. No one apologized. No one adjusted their behavior. And because I didn't react, the moment quietly filed itself away as resolved. That's how normalization works. Not by force, but by repetition. Requests kept coming, wrapped in familiarity. Sometimes they were framed as questions, sometimes as updates. I might need your help this month. Just giving you a heads up. I'll pay you back when things calm down. The words were softer than the expectation behind them. And each time I found a way to say yes without saying yes. I'd pause, I'd calculate, I'd rearrange something internal. Then I'd agree, usually adding a sentence to minimize it. It's fine. Don't worry about it right now. We'll sort it out later. I became fluent in erasing my own resistance. What made it harder to object was that nothing looked unreasonable on its own. Emergencies are persuasive. Stress has a way of making people sound sincere, and because I was capable, it felt cruel to withhold help. So I didn't. Instead, I adjusted my thinking. I told myself this was temporary, that things would stabilize, that once everyone was back on their feet, the dynamic would naturally rebalance. That was the story I told myself to stay comfortable. But the truth was, the more I helped, the less anyone adapted. Why would they? The pressure never reached them. It stopped with me. I noticed it most during conversations where finances were discussed openly, but only selectively. People spoke freely about what they wanted, what they deserved, and what they were entitled to experience. Vacations, upgrades, new starts. No one spoke about restraint or trade-offs or the quiet discipline it took to remain solvent, and no one asked me what I wanted. If I mentioned something I was saving for, it was met with polite acknowledgement, then quickly overshadowed by someone else's immediate need. My plans existed in the future. Their needs existed now. Now, always one. I began to sense a subtle shift in tone when I hesitated. Nothing overt, just a tightening, a glance exchanged, a change in pacing, as if my pause itself was inconvenient. So I stopped pausing. I learned to anticipate requests before they were voiced, to offer solutions preemptively, to smooth things over so no one had to sit with discomfort. That's how I earned my place, by making myself indispensable and undemanding. Looking back, I see how that combination is dangerous. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as rudeness. Sometimes it arrives as reliance without reciprocity, as expectations grow without acknowledgement, as gratitude that never matures into consideration. And because I was calm, because I didn't protest, my silence was interpreted as consent. There were moments when I tried to gently shift things, suggest budgets, ask about long-term plans. The responses were vague, optimistic, and ungrounded. We'll figure it out. Things will change. It won't always be like this. But no one could explain how. I started feeling like the adult in a room full of people who resented being reminded of consequences. And instead of being appreciated for that, I was quietly expected to absorb the weight of it. Still, I told myself this was just how families worked, that being the responsible one meant carrying more. That fairness was a childish expectation. I didn't realize how much that belief cost me. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to confront, but it was constant enough to shape me. It taught me to shrink my needs, to preemptively apologize for boundaries I hadn't even set, to believe that my value came from how little trouble I caused. And slowly that belief began to harden. By the time I noticed how unequal things had become, it already felt normal. Like gravity, like something you don't question because it's always been there. That's the danger of normalization. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and convinces you that this is just the way things are. And if you're not careful, you start protecting the system that's draining you, because challenging it feels more disruptive than enduring it. At that point, I still thought endurance was strength. I hadn't yet learned the difference. The realization didn't come as a revelation, it came as recognition. One evening, after a long workday, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my notebook open in front of me. Numbers filled the pages, not just mine, but everyone else's. I had stopped noticing when that happened. At some point, their lives had blended into my calculations. As I traced the columns with my finger, a thought surfaced that felt uncomfortable in its clarity. This isn't helping anymore. This is a role. I wasn't just supporting my family in moments of need. I had been assigned a permanent position, one that didn't require consent, only compliance. The reliable one, the safety net, the one who will handle it. Roles are powerful because they simplify people. Once you're placed inside one, everything you do is interpreted through it. If I helped, it was expected. If I hesitated, it was noticed. If I ever stopped, it would be remembered. No one sat me down and explained this role. I learned it through patterns. Through whom do people turn first? Through who wasn't asked to change. I realized that my value in the family had become transactional, but quietly so, not in a crude, obvious way, in a polite, well-meaning way that made it hard to object without sounding ungrateful or cold. If I were generous, I was being myself. If I pulled back, I was acting strange. That contrast told me everything. I thought back to how often I'd been praised, not for my presence, but for my function. For fixing things, for being calm, for not needing much. And I saw how little space there was in that role for evolution. I wasn't allowed to struggle, or change, or want something that disrupts the system. My consistency was the foundation others built on, and foundations aren't meant to move. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every conversation seemed to orbit the same center. Plans were made with an invisible asterisk. Claire will help. Decisions were delayed because there was no urgency to act. Someone else was holding the risk. And the most sobering part was this. The role worked. For everyone else. It removed pressure. It softened the consequences. It allowed people to live slightly beyond their means without feeling reckless. The cost was simply outsourced. To me, I understood then why change felt so threatening. If I stepped out of the role, the system would wobble. Not collapse, but reveal itself. And revelation is uncomfortable, so the role had to be protected. And that meant protecting my silence. I realized I had been rewarded not just for helping, but for not asking. Not asking for repayment, not asking for acknowledgement, not asking for balance. My needs didn't fit the role, so they were quietly ignored by others, and eventually by me. That night, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clarity is quieter than anger, but far more destabilizing. Because once you recognize the role you've been assigned, you have a choice. Continue playing it, or accept the consequences of stepping away. At that moment, I wasn't ready to step away. But something fundamental shifted. I stopped telling myself this was accidental. I stopped believing that fairness would emerge on its own. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had avoided for years. What happens if I don't do this anymore? I didn't answer it yet. I just let it exist. And that was enough to change how I moved through the world. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point that others could point to later and say, That's when she changed. It happened on an ordinary morning. I was standing in line at a small cafe near my apartment, half listening to the hum of conversation around me, when my phone vibrated. A message from a family group chat. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it would be. I waited until I had my coffee, until I was seated by the window. Then I read it. Someone needed help again. The message was framed carefully, polite, almost apologetic, but the expectation sat underneath it, familiar and heavy. There was no mention of alternatives, no question about timing, just the assumption that I would make it work. I stared at the screen longer than usual, not because I was angry, but because for the first time I felt detached. I noticed how my body reacted, or rather, how it didn't. No rush of adrenaline, no immediate calculation, just a quiet stillness. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced with startling calm. I don't want to do this. Not I can't. Not I shouldn't. Just I don't want to. That was new. Desire had never been part of the equation before. Capacity and obligation had crowded it out. I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched people pass outside the window. Everyone was carrying something, bags, conversations, their own mornings. No one was thinking about my phone. No one was waiting for me to respond in that moment. The world wasn't holding its breath. That realization landed gently but firmly. I wasn't as central as I had imagined. The pressure existed mostly in my head. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I sat there and let the discomfort bloom fully. I didn't push it down. I didn't soothe it with logic. I let it be awkward, unfamiliar, unresolved. What surprised me most was how clean it felt. Not easy, but clean. I realized that all the previous times I'd said yes quickly, it wasn't generosity that moved me. It was fear. Fear of disrupting the rhythm. Fear of being seen differently. Fear of what silence might communicate. That morning, silence felt like honesty. I eventually replied, briefly, neutral. I said I needed time to think. It wasn't a refusal, but it wasn't compliance either. Nothing dramatic happened. No one panicked. No one confronted me. The chat went quiet for a while, then moved on to other things. But something in me had crossed a line. I noticed it later that day, during a work meeting. I listened more closely. I spoke less. I didn't volunteer solutions that weren't asked for. I observed how often people lean on whoever makes themselves available. It wasn't malicious, it was human. That evening, I went home and opened my notebook again. For the first time, I separated my numbers from everyone else's. Clean pages, clear boundaries. I didn't make a plan. I didn't set rules. I just noticed how much mental space opened up when I wasn't constantly anticipating other people's needs. There was grief in that space, and relief. I understood then that change wouldn't come from confrontation. It would come from restraint. From choosing not to rush in, from allowing small gaps to form where my presence used to be automatic. The shift wasn't visible. No one would have described me as different that day. But internally, I had stopped identifying myself by my usefulness. And once that happens, even quietly, the entire structure begins to loosen. Because you can't unknow the moment you realize that your silence is not a failure. It's a choice. After that morning, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't sit anyone down or explain myself. I simply stopped filling every gap. At first, it felt unnatural, like holding my breath in a room where I'd always spoken freely. When messages came in, I read them once and set my phone down. When conversations drifted toward problems, I listened without immediately offering solutions. Silence, I learned, is uncomfortable mostly for the person who has never used it intentionally. I became more aware of how quickly others reached for me when uncertainty appeared. It was almost automatic. A pause would form and eyes would flick in my direction, even if nothing was said. I didn't meet those looks right away. I wasn't being cold. I was present without performing. What surprised me was how often the moment resolved itself. Someone else would speak. A decision would be made, sometimes clumsy, sometimes imperfect, but made nonetheless. The world didn't end when I didn't step in. That realization was both freeing and unsettling. I began to understand how my constant availability had prevented others from developing their own responses to pressure. not intentionally, but structurally. If there is always a net, no one learns how to land. I also noticed how my silence was interpreted. Some mistook it for a distraction, others for fatigue. A few assumed I was still handling things quietly, just in the background. The idea that I was choosing not to intervene didn't occur to them. And I let that misunderstanding stand, because correcting it would have required an explanation. An explanation would have invited negotiation. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I watched. I watched how quickly expectations surfaced when I didn't respond immediately, how the tone of messages shifted from casual to pointed, how reassurance was sought without being offered in return. I watched my own reactions too. The urge to smooth things over still appeared, reflexive and familiar, but now I recognized it for what it was: conditioning. I learned to sit with that urge without acting on it. There were moments when guilt crept in. It told me I was being selfish, that I was withholding help unnecessarily, that my silence was a form of punishment. I didn't argue with those thoughts. I examined them. And I noticed something important. The guilt only surfaced when others were uncomfortable, not when I was. That distinction mattered. I wasn't refusing out of spite. I wasn't testing anyone. I was simply allowing space where there used to be automatic accommodation. Silence became my way of listening to myself. In that space, I noticed how much energy I had been expending to maintain an image: the calm one, the capable one, the one who doesn't need anything. Letting that image crack felt risky, but also honest. People began to adjust in small ways. They solved minor issues on their own. They delayed requests. They found temporary alternatives. Not because they suddenly became more responsible, but because I wasn't absorbing the pressure anymore. And still no one named it. That was the strangest part. Change was happening, but it was happening indirectly, through absence rather than action. I realized then that dominance doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's simply the refusal to continue playing a role that benefits everyone but you. I wasn't asserting power, I was reclaiming authorship. And because I wasn't loud about it, no one could argue with me. There was nothing to push against. The silence did its work slowly. By the end of that period, I felt steadier, not because things were resolved, but because I was no longer betraying myself in the small moments. Silence had stopped being avoidance. It had become aligned. While everyone else adjusted to my quieter presence, something else was happening, something they never noticed because it didn't interrupt them. I was preparing, not in a dramatic way. There were no secret meetings or late-night revelations, just small, deliberate acts of attention that accumulated over time. I began by observing patterns instead of reacting to them. I noticed who asked for help first and who benefited most. I noticed which requests were framed as urgent and which were simply habitual. I noticed how often temporary situations had no clear endpoint, and I started documenting, not emotionally but practically. In my notebook, I wrote down dates, amounts, reasons given, promises implied. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building clarity for myself. Seeing everything laid out on paper stripped the narrative of its softness. What felt like generosity when isolated looked like dependency when aggregated. That mattered. I also paid attention to language. The way, "can you help?" had gradually turned into, "I'll need you to." The way gratitude faded once reliability was established. The way my past yeses were used to justify future expectations. No one noticed me listening more than speaking. They assumed I was still the same, just quieter, still thinking, still managing. I let them believe that. At the same time, I began strengthening my own position. I restructured my finances, not to hide anything, but to protect them. I separated accounts, set clearer internal rules, created buffers that were no longer available by default. None of this affected anyone else yet. That was intentional. I learned more too. Not just about money, but about boundaries. About how systems resist change, not because they are malicious, but because they are efficient. About how people often don't realize they're overreaching until access is removed. The more I learned, the calmer I became. There was no rush, no deadline. I wasn't planning a confrontation, I was preparing for inevitability. Because once you stop cushioning consequences, they eventually surface. I noticed how my family spoke about responsibility when it applied to others, and how vague it became when it applied to themselves. I noticed how my absence in problem-solving conversations created discomfort, but also possibility. Still, no one asked me directly if something was wrong. They didn't notice because nothing had happened yet. From the outside, I was still present, still polite, still me. And that was the point. Preparation doesn't need an audience. In quiet moments, I asked myself hard questions. What was I willing to lose? Approval? Access? The version of myself they preferred? What was I no longer willing to pay for? Those answers came slowly, but they came. I realized that my leverage wasn't money. It was predictability. The system relied on my consistency more than my generosity, and consistency can be withdrawn without confrontation. That understanding grounded me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was intentional. They never noticed the shift because it didn't announce itself. It didn't disrupt dinners or holidays. It didn't change my tone. It changed my position. And by the time they sensed something was different, the groundwork had already been laid. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from a pattern finally completing itself. One evening, I spread my notes across the table, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was ready to see the full picture without flinching. Dates lined up, amounts repeated. Reasons echoed each other with minor variations. What I saw wasn't chaos. It was structured. A system had formed around me. And the most sobering part wasn't how much I had given. It was how expected it had become. That's when I understood my leverage clearly for the first time. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel powerful in the way movies depict power. It felt neutral, almost clinical. I realized that nothing in the system worked without my participation, not because I was extraordinary, but because I was consistent. I bridged gaps others never closed. I absorbed risk others never planned for. I made the delay painless. I was the quiet student. And once you see that, the illusion disappears. There was no anger in that moment, no urge to expose anyone, just a clean internal sentence. If I stop, everything changes. Not collapses, changes. That distinction mattered. I wasn't holding people hostage. I was holding the balance. And balance, once shifted, doesn't require permission. I tested the insight gently. I declined a small request, not outright, but by redirecting it. I suggested an alternative, a delay, a different solution. The reaction was subtle but telling: confusion, mild frustration, a hint of disbelief. Not because the request was essential, but because the outcome was no longer guaranteed. That confirmed it. I hadn't been supporting emergencies. I had been stabilizing habits. The reveal wasn't about them. It was about me finally seeing myself accurately. Not as selfish for wanting boundaries, not as generous for overextending, just as someone whose role had outgrown consent. And with that clarity came restraint. I didn't rush to act. I didn't announce my realization. I let it settle. Because leverage used impulsively turns into conflict. Leverage used calmly becomes autonomy. I adjusted my inner language. I stopped asking, "Is this fair to them?" and started asking, "Is this sustainable for me?" That single shift changed everything. I also accepted something difficult. People might not like the version of me that emerged. Not because it was cruel, but because it disrupted their sense of certainty. And that was okay. The reveal stripped away the fantasy that this could be fixed through better communication alone. Words wouldn't undo a system built on years of silent agreement. Only action or inaction would. For the first time, I wasn't planning how to help. I was planning how to step back without drama. That required patience. Because when you've been predictable for a long time, even small deviations feel seismic to others. But privately, I was steady. I knew now that I didn't need to justify myself with emotion or explanation. The truth didn't need to be argued. It would express itself through absence. The reveal wasn't celebratory. It was grounding. I slept better after that. Not because things were resolved, but because I was no longer confused about my position. Clarity is a kind of peace, and once you have it, you stop negotiating with yourself. Clarity narrows your options. Once I understood the system I was part of, there were only a few paths forward, and pretending nothing had changed was no longer one of them. I didn't feel rushed to decide, but I felt anchored, like a compass had finally stopped spinning. I laid out the options honestly, without romanticizing any of them. The first was to continue as I had, just more consciously, to keep helping but with clearer internal limits. That option appealed to the part of me that valued harmony. It would preserve relationships. It would avoid discomfort. It would keep me recognizable. But when I examined it closely, I saw the cost. It required me to remain the stabilizer, the interpreter, the buffer. It asked me to carry responsibility without authority. That wasn't a compromise. It was a delay. The second option was to confront everything directly, to sit everyone down and explain how things had affected me, to renegotiate expectations out loud. That option sounded fair in theory, honest, adult. But I knew my family well enough to know how that conversation would go. There would be apologies, sincere ones, promises to change, emotional reassurances. And then slowly, things would drift back. Not out of malice, but inertia. Because systems don't change just because they're named. They change when incentives do. I didn't want temporary understanding. I wanted a structural change. The third option was the hardest and the simplest. To stop, not dramatically, not with ultimatums, just to withdraw from the role entirely, to allow the consequences of absence to land where they belonged. This option meant accepting misunderstanding, discomfort, possibly distance. It also meant accepting that I couldn't control how others would interpret my silence, that they might see it as coldness or punishment or betrayal. What I could control was my integrity. I sat with that option the longest. I asked myself what I was actually afraid of. Losing closeness or losing approval? Being seen as less generous or being seen clearly for the first time? The answer surprised me. I wasn't afraid of losing people. I was afraid of losing the version of myself they relied on. That realization made the decision inevitable. I didn't announce it. I didn't mark a date. I simply chose, internally, that I would no longer intervene by default. From that point on, every request would be met with a pause. Every expectation would have to be spoken aloud. Every transfer would require a reason that stood up to daylight. This wasn't punishment. It was alignment. I knew that once I crossed this line, there would be no clean way back. Even if I changed my mind later, something fundamental would have shifted. The illusion of endless availability would be gone. That was the irreversible part, and I accepted it. The decision didn't feel empowering in the cinematic sense. It felt sobering, like signing a document you know will change your life, not because it's dramatic, but because it's final. I went to bed that night without relief, without excitement, just a quiet certainty. Whatever came next, I would meet it without betraying myself. That was the choice. Once the decision was made, there was nothing left to announce. I didn't wake up the next day feeling different. I still went to work. I still answered messages. I still showed up to family gatherings with the same calm expression. On the surface, nothing had shifted, but underneath, everything had. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about restraint, about letting actions replace explanations. I began by changing my timing. I didn't respond immediately anymore, not to requests, not to hints disguised as updates. I let hours pass, sometimes a day, not as a tactic, but as a filter. Urgency reveals itself when it's real. Everything else fades. And a surprising amount faded. Some problems resolved themselves before I ever replied. Bills were negotiated, plans were scaled down. Other people stepped in. It was subtle but undeniable. When I didn't rush, others adapted. I also stopped offering preventative help. No more just-in-case transfers. No more smoothing things over before discomfort had a chance to surface. If someone hadn't asked clearly, I didn't assume they needed me. That alone changed the dynamic. When requests did come, I responded carefully. I asked questions I'd never asked before. What's the plan after this? What alternatives have you considered? What happens if I'm not able to help next time? These weren't accusations, they were clarifications. Some people answered vaguely, some became defensive. A few were surprised by the questions themselves, as if accountability had entered the room unexpectedly. I didn't argue, I listened. And then sometimes I said no. Not with justification, not with emotion, just no. Those numbers were small, measured, and infrequent at first. But each one carried weight because it wasn't followed by rescue. Behind the scenes, I finalized the structural changes I'd begun earlier. My finances were cleanly separated, automatic transfers ended. Informal arrangements quietly expired. No one noticed immediately because nothing had collapsed yet. That was the hardest part, resisting the urge to step in when I could see stress building. I had trained myself for years to relieve pressure the moment it appeared. Now I let it exist. Not out of cruelty, out of respect for reality. I reminded myself daily, discomfort is not harm. Consequences are not punishment. Growth requires contact with both. And still, I stayed kind. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I didn't become distant or cold. I laughed. I listened. I showed up. The only thing I removed was my automatic problem solving. That confused people. They sensed something had changed, but they couldn't name it. I was still there, but not available in the same way. Still present, but no longer positioned as the solution. Because I hadn't explained myself, there was nothing to argue against, no statement to dissect, no boundary to negotiate. Just a gap where I used to be. That gap did more than any speech ever could. I understood then why silence is often mistaken for weakness. It looks passive. It looks like an absence. But when chosen deliberately, it's one of the most powerful forms of agency there is. By the time anyone thought to ask me what was going on, the system had already begun to adjust, and it would not adjust back. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They appeared in fragments, small disturbances that were easy to dismiss at first. A bill that couldn't be delayed, a plan that suddenly required compromise, a conversation that ended without resolution. At first, my family treated these moments as coincidences, bad timing, temporary stress. Nothing to connect yet, but I could see the pattern forming. Without my intervention, pressure began to travel where it always should have, back to the people generating it. Decisions that had once been postponed now demanded attention. Comfort thinned, frustration surfaced, and with it, confusion. I received more messages, not requests exactly, but check-ins, questions disguised as concern. Everything okay? You've been quiet, just making sure you're not overwhelmed. The irony didn't escape me. For years, no one had asked how I was when I was carrying the most. Now that I wasn't, my silence registered as a problem. I answered neutrally. I reassured without re-entering the role. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. That restraint unsettled them more than anger ever would have. I watched how conversations shifted, how people began discussing money with less certainty, how optimism gave way to anxiety when there was no invisible backstop. Some became irritated, not at the situation, but at the uncertainty. They wanted predictability back. They wanted the old rhythm. They wanted me, but no one said it directly. Instead, there were comments. Things are just harder lately. I don't know why everything feels so tight. It's like nothing's lining up. I listened. I noticed how often my absence was felt but not acknowledged, how the discomfort was externalized rather than examined. Still, I stayed steady. This was the phase I had prepared for, the one where consequences emerge without clear attribution, where frustration searches for a cause but hasn't named it yet. It wasn't pleasant to watch. There were moments I felt the old pull, the urge to smooth things over, to reinsert myself and restore calm. But I remembered why calm had come so easily before. It was purchased. I also noticed something else, something quieter. A few people began adjusting. They made different choices. Smaller plans, harder conversations. They didn't enjoy it, but they did it. Those were the moments that told me this wasn't cruelty. It was a correction. The consequences weren't designed, they were inevitable. And still, no one accused me. Not yet. Because nothing I had done was overt. There was no rule I had broken, no promise I had explicitly rescinded. I had simply stopped compensating. That ambiguity was powerful. It forced people to sit with the results of their own assumptions, to feel the weight of the choices they had outsourced. By the end of that period, the discomfort was no longer isolated. It had become shared, and shared discomfort demands resolution. I knew what was coming next. Once the discomfort became undeniable, the tone changed. The messages grew more frequent, more direct. There was urgency now, not because the problems were bigger, but because the old solutions were no longer guaranteed. I could feel the shift in how people spoke to me. The casual confidence had thinned. Requests came wrapped in explanation again, as if effort might substitute for access. I didn't realize things were this tight. We're just in a rough patch. It won't always be like this. The familiar phrases returned, but this time they landed differently. Not because I was hardened, but because I was clear. I listened, I acknowledged, I didn't step in. At some point, someone suggested we all sit down and talk things through. The implication was gentle, but obvious. Something had gone wrong, and it needed fixing. I agreed to the conversation, not because I intended to negotiate, but because I wanted to witness what happened when the system tried to repair itself. The meeting was emotional in small ways. Not explosive, just tense. People spoke about stress, about feeling unsupported, about how things had suddenly become harder. No one mentioned money directly at first. No one mentioned me. Then gradually, the focus drifted. I just thought we were all helping each other. We've always leaned on you. You never minded before. We didn't know it was a problem. Those sentences weren't accusations, they were explanations. Attempts to return to equilibrium. I let them finish. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice calm. I didn't list grievances, I didn't recount sacrifices, I didn't defend myself. I said one thing: I'm not available in the same way anymore. Silence followed. Not because they were shocked, but because there was nothing to argue with. I didn't justify it with emotion. I didn't invite debate. I stated a fact. That's when panic surfaced. Not loud, but visible. People realized that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't something that could be smoothed over with reassurance. They asked questions. What had changed? Was I upset? Had someone done something wrong? I answered honestly, but briefly. I had changed. No one had to be blamed. The arrangement no longer worked for me. That was when it became too late. Because by the time people recognize a system is failing, it's usually already dependent on it. And dependency resists removal. There were promises then. Offers to pay me back eventually. Vague commitments to do better. Emotional appeals disguised as accountability. I listened, and I declined. Not harshly, not triumphantly, just firmly. The realization spread slowly across the room. The role I had played was not available for renegotiation. It had ended, and with that realization came grief. Not just for the support they'd lost, but for the certainty they'd assumed. Some were hurt, some were frustrated, some were quiet. But none of it changed my position, because the time to fix it had passed. Not out of punishment, but out of necessity. I had already built a different structure, one that didn't depend on me disappearing. And once that structure exists, going back feels like a collapse. The confrontation everyone expected never really happened. There was no raised voice, no dramatic ultimatum, no moment anyone could point to and say that's when everything broke. What happened instead was quieter and far more definitive. A few days after that group conversation, one family member reached out privately. Not to argue, but to understand. Or maybe to persuade. It was hard to tell. We met for coffee. The atmosphere was cautious, almost formal, as if we were both aware that something delicate was being handled, and neither of us wanted to be the one to shatter it. They spoke first, about how much pressure they were under, about how they hadn't realized how much they relied on me, about how things felt different now, unstable. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, they waited expectantly. The pause had weight. This was the moment when I used to reassure, to soften, to offer a bridge back. I didn't, I said calmly. I understand that this is hard. I also understand that it's not mine to fix anymore. There was no accusation in my tone, no bitterness, just clarity. They tried again, framing it as fairness, as shared responsibility, as family loyalty. I didn't argue those values. I just declined to interpret them as an obligation. I said, I'm still here, I care, but I'm not taking on that role again. The words felt solid when they left my mouth, not defensive, not rehearsed, true. There was a long silence after that. I could see them recalibrating, not just the conversation, but their understanding of me. The version of me they had known didn't fit the moment anymore. And that's when I understood something important. Confrontation doesn't need heat to be final. It needs consistency. I didn't waver. I didn't offer exceptions. I didn't soften the message with guilt or apology. I also didn't escalate. I let the boundary stand on its own. When the conversation ended, there was no resolution in the traditional sense. No agreement, no closure. Just an understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and that was enough. After that, there were fewer attempts. People began to accept the new reality. Not happily, but realistically. They adjusted their expectations because they had to. I noticed how my calm unsettled them more than anger would have. There was no narrative to attach it to, no drama to rally around, just a quiet refusal to return. That's the power of confrontation without heat. It doesn't invite performance, it doesn't create winners and losers, it simply marks an end. I walked away from that conversation lighter, not because I had stood up for myself, but because I hadn't betrayed myself. There's a difference, and once you experience it, you don't forget how it feels. What surprised me most about the aftermath wasn't the distance, it was the quiet. Once the role ended, there was a lull. Fewer messages, fewer assumptions, fewer moments where I was expected to step in and smooth things over. At first, that silence felt unfamiliar. I had been woven so tightly into the fabric of everyone else's stability that absence felt like erasure. But slowly I understood it wasn't erasure, it was space. In that space, I began to meet myself again. Not as a function, but as a person. I noticed how much lighter my mind felt when it wasn't constantly forecasting other people's emergencies. How my thoughts stretched further than the next problem. How my energy returned when it wasn't being rationed. I didn't become colder, I became clearer. I still showed up to family gatherings. I still listened. I still cared. But I no longer felt the subtle anxiety that used to hum beneath every interaction. The awareness that I might be needed at any moment. I had stepped out of readiness mode. Some relationships adjusted. A few grew more distant, not out of anger, but because the dynamic had been the glue. When the role disappeared, there wasn't much left to negotiate. That was painful, but honest. Other relationships changed in quieter, more respectful ways. Conversations became more balanced. Requests were rarer, more considered. When help was offered, it was mutual, not assumed. Those changes mattered. I also changed how I saw myself. For a long time, I believed my worth was tied to my usefulness. That being needed was proof of value. Letting go of that belief required mourning, not just the relationships, but the identity I had built around it. I had to learn that being present without solving is still presence. That saying no doesn't erase compassion. That boundaries don't make you selfish, they make you legible to yourself. I stopped measuring my goodness by how much I gave away. I started measuring it by how honestly I lived. There was no victory lap, no moment where everything felt perfectly aligned, just a steady sense that I was no longer living against myself. And that was enough. I learned that quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authority over your own participation. The ability to decide where your energy goes and where it doesn't, without needing approval. That kind of dominance doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't demand attention, but it reshapes everything beneath it. I'm not the person my family relied on in the same way anymore. And that's okay. I'm someone they now have to meet where I actually am, not where they were comfortable placing me. And for the first time, I feel like my life belongs to me. There's a version of this story that could end with blame, with anger, with a list of who was wrong and how much it all cost me. But that's not the truth I want to leave you with. What I learned is quieter and harder to accept. Most people don't exploit you because they're cruel. They do it because the system allows it, because your silence makes it easy, because your reliability removes the urgency for change. And the moment you stop participating, the system reveals itself. Saying no was more expensive than money. It cost me familiarity. It cost me a role that made others comfortable. It cost me the illusion that being needed was the same as being valued. But it gave me something far more durable. It gave me authorship. I didn't win. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't even prove a point. I simply stopped absorbing what wasn't mine to carry. And in doing that, I learned a truth that applies far beyond money or family. You don't need to explain yourself to stop overgiving. You don't need permission to step out of a role that's hurting you. And you don't need to be loud to be final. Quiet dominance is choosing alignment over approval, even when it costs you relationships that only worked when you were smaller. If this story resonates, it might not be because your situation looks the same, but because the feeling does. The slow compression, the normalization of overextension, the fear that saying no will cost you everything. Sometimes it does cost you something, but sometimes what it cost you was never yours to pay. I'm curious, have you ever realized too late that you were holding a system together by yourself? And if you did, what happened when you finally let go? I'll be reading the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.